Welcome, everyone. Everyone has dependencies. We like those huge package JSON files and so on with all the fancy dependencies and how to manage them properly and all the other things we will learn from Tobias from SAP. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah. Thank you. Glad to be here. Over the next time, I want to show you a bit on how we started to automate our dependency management. What are some of the lessons we learned, and hopefully some of the things you can take away to not repeat what we did. Yeah, so quick introduction, SAP, most of you probably have heard of it, worked with it, liked it, and we are doing a lot of enterprise software. We have a lot of products, over 1,000 products we sell to different companies, to different lines of businesses. And we have internally over 40,000 developers. With that many developers, a lot of dependencies we need to manage. Lastly, I'm part of our open source program office. We are doing all things related to open source. And some of the things I like to do is help our developers having a better life, managing all their automation and trying to make it as easy for them as possible. So, SAP, large company, a lot of dependencies. Quick guess from around, how many dependencies do we leverage internally? Anyone want to guess? Yeah, it's not infinite, but it's more than 20,000. All through that number is not very precise because we will later see that it's not that hard to count what is even a dependencies. But why are dependencies important? If we look at our products and an individual product, the product code itself is built on top of a lot of dependencies. And from an individual product perspective, the dependencies are a huge iceberg under the water with having a lot of impact on the product. That can be very positive. Performance improvements in the dependencies can have a huge impact on the actual product. Security improvements or even developer usability improvements in the dependencies can be very positive for the product code. Unfortunately, the reverse is true as well. So anything negative happening in the dependencies can have a huge impact on the product code as well. Security vulnerabilities, performance degradation, all that kind. So it's rather important that we take care of our dependencies and ensure that we know what we have there and can see if there's better alternatives available, better improvements and things like that. We already touched on it, but what even are dependencies? Roger mentioned it in the beginning already. If you think about a Node.js project, the first thing where you think about dependencies is a huge package JSON with a lot of dependencies in it. But are you aware that in the same file, there's an engines field where you can specify which runtime your program should run on and depends on? So kind of a dependency as well. If you containerize your application, you most likely have a Docker file as well with a specific version of Node, for example, which you want to use as a dependency for your project. Hopefully, you have an CI pipeline, and as we heard yesterday, GitLab has that as well, that you can reuse pipeline steps and components in specific versions. And so if you use a specific version, you want to keep them up to date as well, getting new improvements and not stay on V2 for the rest of your life. And inside your pipeline, you maybe even use other versions and set up, for example, a specific version of Node to use in your pipeline. So all these things are already 5 types of dependencies we have for a rather small Node.js project, which we all need to take care of, which we all need to track and remind ourselves. So we have now a project with dependencies. We have a developer who wants to update them and keep them up to date and check if there's something new happening. What do they need to do? They will start off with first figuring out what even are the dependencies of my project. And that's, as we saw previously, not that straightforward. It's not just looking at the package JSON, but as the indirect dependencies or like engine dependencies your project has, which might need updating as well. So we figured out our dependencies, then we need to figure out where to even look them up. Something like Node.js dependencies is rather straightforward to look up on npm.js. But what's the official source of truth for the newest version of Node.js itself? Is it npm.js? Is it the Node.js website? And if we are looking at internal dependencies or third-party commercial dependencies, things get way more complicated, and you probably need to write a long guide where you need to now look up which dependencies, which is probably outdated the day after you write it. But let's say we were able to figure out where to look it up and found out that a new version is available and we want to do an update. As a developer, I then need to go ahead, take my project, clone it down, perform the update locally, maybe run the tests locally beforehand, grab a coffee in the meantime, and after all is run through and it's green, I can finally create my pull request to the project saying, hey, this is a dependency update, I tested it locally, it looks good. And then we still need to wait for our automation and CI system to confirm that the change is indeed working and for a review from another developer to get it merged. And then the whole process starts again, and you can see a lot of involvement of a developer here. They have to do a lot of context switches, and generally not a process which many people really enjoy doing. And if you don't enjoy it, be certain you are not alone there. A survey by Sonatype found that over half of developers agreed that updating dependencies was considered painful, and I can only fully agree. We saw internally two things which resulted out of that, or more like one thing is that most of the time developers looked at it and updating dependencies and did following nothing. They just stayed on the version they are having as long as there's no problem or they are not forced to do anything. They stay on the version which works for them, which is nice until there comes a release and they are required to perform an update. So before a release, they need to go ahead, check out that if there are new dependencies available, they need to update too, and that adds a lot of crunch right before release time, which we want to avoid because they have a whole bunch of other things to do at that point. But okay, the release is done and things continue until a security vulnerability is found. And now teams scramble to perform an update, have a lot of effort after a security vulnerability is found to perform an update, run through the 5 steps, and then afterwards nothing happens again. So this is not our desired state, and luckily for us, and luckily for you, this is not a problem only we faced, but rather the industry as a whole faced. And there is, luckily for us, a lot of automation available, and I want to give a shout out to 2 tools, and one in more detail. If you're on github.com, you probably already have seen this icon, Dependabot by GitHub, which creates automatically a pull request when a new version is available, which is really cool. And something which I just wrote yesterday is that Dependabot is now available under MIT as well, rather than a server-side public license, I think it was previously. So that's really cool. But we ended up using not Dependabot, but rather Renovate, which performs more or less the same thing. It looks up if a new version of a dependency is available and creates a pull request with a new version. But why is this cool and why didn't we outsource that to a working student, rather used an automation for that? And that's a few of the advantages we saw when using this automation is that it supports multiple ecosystems and you get a pull request updating your Docker file in the same way you get when updating your NPM dependencies. From a process and developer looking at it, it's the same thing. If it's now a Docker file, it's NPM, it's Go, you get all the information in the same way and don't need to difference between now the different ecosystems, which is super helpful if you have a project with a lot of different dependency ecosystems, that you get that in a uniform way. Even more interesting for us is we not only use a lot of open source dependencies, but as well internal dependencies. So updating these is even more hard because you can't just Google if there's a new version, but you rather have to go into our internal registry to figure that out. And so having automation there to figure that out is super helpful as well. And we can pretty much reuse the things we have in our source code saying, hey, look it up in a specific private registry. And Renovate will then use that information to look up the dependency there as well. So I don't need to document somewhere specifically that Now to get a new version, I need to look at an URL, but it rather takes it directly from the configuration I have in my project, which is as well used, for example, by NPM to resolve the URLs and dependencies. And we again get the same update workflow, be it open source dependencies, be it internal dependencies. And as a developer, I don't really need to care about if this is now an open source dependencies or internal dependency in the updating workflow, but I can treat them as the same and just care about, hey, these are my dependencies. I probably should keep them up to date. And the last thing, which is most important advantage we saw, is that computers do the actual work. We don't need a developer performing the update cycle, but rather the developer only comes in at the latest possible point, meaning we already have the feedback from the CI system telling us, hey, this looks kind of good. This pull request seems, or this update seems to be compatible. You maybe only need to check the changelogs once and then can say, hey, that's fine, merge it, and I'm in and out of this review in a minute, rather than having a lot of context switches. But the opposite is true as well. If I know there's something going wrong, I maybe already get an information saying, hey, this update looks like it's breaking something. A developer probably should invest some time into looking how to make this update compatible with the existing source code, or say, hey, okay, that's acceptable, we stay on the version. And from a development lifecycle perspective, we can better plan for this and say, okay, maybe in the next sprint, somebody should take an hour or two to look at that and investigate that. Because previously, it was like, hey, we are now updating dependencies. This might take 5 minutes and we are done. This might take 5 days and we are not done. And so having this certainty, or at least this clue if an update is generally compatible or not before even starting to work on it, is super helpful in the planning phase for us as well. And then I want to show you some more cool things which we got a lot of benefit from when introducing it. That's metadata for dependency updates. You most likely have seen a lot of changelogs for dependencies, and if you manually create a pull request, you are maybe lucky if a developer includes like a short summary, maybe even a link to the changelogs, and that's super helpful for the reviewer in the moment. But if you come back a year later to maybe figure out if that was now the cause for a bug, changelog URLs might be broken, and the 2 sentences a developer put in the pull request might be not sufficient knowledge. Automation has the advantage, and Renovate does that very nicely, is to pretty much already include the full changelogs, so you already have pretty much a hard copy of the changelogs if you ever need to go back in your commit history, or in this case, in your pull request history. The same applies for these nice yellow banners, which you probably have seen on GitHub, is, hey, there are vulnerabilities in your dependencies, and Renovate is actually able to read them and pretty much include the information inside of your pull request saying, hey, this pull request, this update specifically addresses a vulnerability. Here is already the details for the vulnerability. And maybe if you see that this pull request breaks, we already have potential workarounds listed so that we have all the information at one place and don't need to go looking at 5 different places and tools, reducing a lot of the friction and context switches a developer has to do, and overall improving the developer experience. And the last cool thing, which we actually are using a lot of internally, is updating of so-called non-standard packages. Package JSON is well defined, a Docker file and an image in there is rather well defined, but you probably have seen something like this, where you have a random version defined in some YAML file, which points to a dependency, and that's passed by either a bash script or some other tooling. Which is nice, and it solves a lot of problems, but it's the places you most likely are not tracking actively to keep up to date. Either because nobody knows about it, because we didn't write it in our document where to look for dependencies, other automation might not catch it, and so the cool thing about Renovate is that you can write regular expression managers, which pretty much tell, hey, in the next line we have dependencies, and please use, in this case, GitHub tags and the repository HashiCorp Terraform to look up the version and propose me updates to that as well, because this is a version I want to track. I do need to add some metadata to it so automation knows what exactly this is and needs to look up. But it gives me, in the end, this nice pull request where we get an update for the actual Terraform file down here, as well as an update for this action workflow now with that version up there. Keeping both versions aligned, because you probably already run into the issue as well that you update the dependency in one version, but it needs to be updated in a second version, and you forgot that. And then you need to create another pull request to update it in the other place so that the versions don't drift. Having automation take care of that ensures that this is consistent and we can keep updating that all the way. What we saw after introducing Renovate to projects at SAP is that the effort we had previously pretty much changed. We rather had a more flat line. It's a bit higher than not doing anything at all, but it's a more plannable and more stable workload on the teams. And we even got the feedback from individual product teams that, hey, they don't need to worry about dependency management before a release anymore, because they are proactively and continuously updating their dependencies. And so when a special event comes, they don't have extra effort, but it's rather just a normal day for them. The same thing for security vulnerabilities, because they already have a nice process in place and automation. Updating dependencies to fix a vulnerability is no big deal as long as the update itself doesn't break anything. But most security patches are not breaking. So this is kind of helpful for. Okay, so we introduced automation and everything is great and nothing went wrong ever. Unfortunately not. But rather, we saw some challenges which I want to highlight as well. The first thing is, quite funny, nuking your CI system. Having automation open pull requests is nice, but having automation or CI testing them is nice as well. The problem is, if you get like 70 pull requests at once, and now your CI system is working for the next 3 days on testing these pull requests, and no developer pull requests went through. Our lessons learned from that is, yeah, CI can be easily overwhelmed, and that all the processes around your development need to adjust as well, and it's a great point in time to improve them. So what we ended up doing with teams which had this challenge is, hey, we looked at, can we prioritize developer CI jobs over automation CI jobs? So if there's downtime, I don't care if they test 70 Renovate pull requests. But if a developer opens a bug fix, that should be tested immediately. And these things help as well when further introducing other automation and better things, so it improves the whole developer experience along the way. And when we started off, start small. Don't try to roll it out to everyone at once, but rather a small subset of teams. Renovate has a nice feature to say, hey, I only want to get 2 or 5 update pull requests at once, so I don't overwhelm both the team and their CI automation, because 2 pull requests can be easily handled, 70 not so much. The next thing we saw is, and I want to take Helm as an example here, is there's a lot of dependencies which are defined in somewhat ambiguous ways. So everybody does it slightly different, and it's quite hard to standardize on this. You can manage dependencies in a Helm file, similar to as I showed for with non-standard packages, so we can write a custom regular expression to match them and update them. But that's probably not what we want to do, because regular expressions are a pain and we need to keep them stable and they might break, and it's generally not a good experience. Luckily, Renovate and other tooling pretty much follow, I would say, industry standards, best practices, or common occurrences. So if we update our, for example, Helm values to follow their naming scheme and what they expect, for example, to have the image called repository, have the version called tag instead of tag version, and using that across our tooling, it can be natively updated. We don't need to write manually regular expressions to match them. And it can be standardized across all our projects internally, meaning that if a developer looks at that, they expect the same format as well and don't need to think, okay, if they now write custom registry, they actually do mean registry, and having this standardization makes things a lot easier for both automation as well as developers. And in this case, not only for Renovate as automation, but as well for other automation we built on top of it, because we can rely on that most of them are doing it in a similar fashion. Lastly, I want to show that how things grow at SAP. We had a total of now slightly over 400,000 update pull requests which we created, and over 3/3 of them actually got merged, while a lot of them either got superseded by another update pull request, or we as well see quite a few of open ones. What's quite interesting, and I am not sure if you can see it, is if you look at the graph for open pull requests, you can actually see the weekend where pull requests are created, and then a sharp downturn on Monday when developers review them, get them merged first thing in the morning, and you get like a little chainsaw style graph there. And while rolling it out, we started rather small, just for our team in the beginning. And then other teams came to us and said, hey, that's super cool what you're doing, and started and wanted to adopt it as well. So we ended up providing it as a service internally to others. And that's rather easy to get started. And then it's pretty much spread out across the whole thing without rather having a central mandate. So we have seen that developers and development teams really like using it without being forced to do so. And that's quite awesome for us. And I want to finish off with our lessons learned. Pretty much try to find out if there is automation for the things you are doing manually, be it open source automation like Renovate now. It's great to have these things automated. And even if the initial effort is higher, you will profit from it, having it streamlined, having it automated, and as well then documented in this automation. So you don't need to rely on the knowledge in people's head or in outdated knowledge in some documentation. And when introducing automation, consider the whole development workflow, not only looking at what one specific thing and trying to improve it and everything around it catches fire, but rather you need to think about, hey, how has this impact on other things which are happening before or after, and how can I maybe improve them as well, or do I need to touch them as well? Because otherwise you start introducing things in one place and break everything else, and everybody is then unhappy with that. And last thing is, don't stand still, try to improve continuously, make things better, and yeah, that's my point. Thank you very much, and I want to give one last shout out to the awesome open source project Renovate. So if you haven't heard about it and want to try it out, it's not from us, but it's great. Try it out, it's awesome. Thank you.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. It was really great. I have a question. Can you elaborate a little bit more about this prioritization of developers' merge requests or pull requests over Renovate CI jobs? You were talking about this, like that's a difficult word in English. Okay, how to make priority of developer merge requests over Renovate?
Yeah, sure. So the specific team in question, they had heavy users of Jenkins, and there exists I think a Jenkins plugin where you can say that specific alphas or specific pull request authors should get a different priority than getting queued. So in Jenkins, you have a challenge that you only have a limited number of build agents. And so if you have a large project or a rather small project with, like, let's say only 2 build agents and get like 70 pull requests, they would normally get queued by time of arrival. And that's a bit of annoying for developers which then are in place 71 pretty much, and automation runs for other automated pull requests. So you can say, okay, pull requests created by our service user, they should be lower. And so if there's another pull request or another build job triggered by someone not from our automation, it should get queued next rather than our automation. But that highly depends on your CI system, if that is possible and how that exactly is possible. But most of them have this concept, or at best you leverage a CI system which doesn't have that bottleneck, and where you can pretty much just run 100 jobs in parallel and don't have to worry about that.
So at Siemens, we're actually heavy users of Renovate as well, and I think this guy over here is kind of top 3 contributor to Renovate. But so you mentioned you also do private dependencies, and I guess you have a GitHub and self-hosted instance. How do you manage credentials for private registries if you have a single instance? Like, do you let projects do that on their own, or do you have like a centralized credentials? Yeah.
Super interesting question, and very valid concern. What we have been doing is that we pretty much provide one central Renovate instance where people can onboard via installation of a GitHub app, similar on how it's done on github.com. And then we inject credentials for our internal common registries into it. So we have like central registries where each SAP employee as well has access to. So these credentials we provide centrally, but we do restrict that people can run custom post-processing jobs so that they don't easily exfiltrate the credentials. And via some magic, we then change the credentials as well, I think, daily or hourly, so that people, even if they get exfiltrated, we can get them contained rather quickly. The other thing we are offering, and which is, or not we, but Renovate offers, and we are as well using internally, is that we allow people to pretty much have their own service user, for example, for an Artifactory repository, encrypt their credentials and commit them directly to the Renovate configuration they have inside their project, so that if they have a registry where only their team should have access to, they can provide credentials for that. But we generally encourage, because I would say like 90+% of the artifacts are available to SAP as a whole, that they rather rely on a central service user rather than trying to self-manage credentials, because managing credentials is a pain.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. Great information, and I have 2 views on this. So one is from the developer point of view. Yeah, the Renovate bug is cool, but my other job is license compliance. So that means for an organization like Siemens, every component, every open source component that we use costs some money. It costs effort. And if we would just assume it's, let's say, 1 hour to check license compliance, security vulnerabilities, patent issues, whatever, then if you, by chance, with a single click or with a single automation step, add 70 new components, someone needs to spend 70 hours working on them. So that means if I have to report this for a whole organization to management, if everybody would use this, then we would end up with hundreds of thousands of hours of additional work. And we did this in the past. And then the management asked, hey, why do the projects do this? And I explained them, well, many of them just press a button, update all dependencies. And the manager asked, but why do they do this? Do they think about what they are updating, or are they just pressing the button? And the sad story is that at least half of the teams just press the button. And so when we try to find information, why did you update this component? Or for example, why did team A and location Zug update the Golang version, but the other teams did not do this? So then we have some kind of imbalance. And the overall story is that this is, it's complicated. And our way, so let's say the management idea is more like, if you have a reason for update, sure, do it. If you can automate things, sure, do it. If you have a tool that tells you these are things you could update, this is fine, but it should be a conscious decision. There should be a reason for it. And whenever we have a location where the teams, maybe 10 teams cooperate, then the total number of updates that we have is far smaller. So we have less cost, but still we are more early on the market because the total work that we have is lower. Yep. So this is just my 5 cents on this.
Yep, I fully agree. And I have two maybe interesting points to that as well. One thing is what we internally saw is that pretty much because we are such a big organization, somebody updates anyway. So it's better. So luckily for us, our review process for a dependency and a specific dependency version is rather slim. So not much manual effort required there to get a version approved initially, especially if the dependency itself is already approved. So version updates only require minimal effort to get approved. And that's as well a check which directly reports inside the pull request as well. And the advantage is having that already done beforehand, or having the pull request created and letting it then automatically be reviewed by license compliance. And they say, okay, it's nice. You already have everything in place to get it merged. So you don't need, if there's now a critical thing coming up and you need to update, you don't have to rely on that time frame to get it reviewed by somebody else. But I fully agree that updating just for the sake of updating is probably not the best strategy. However, I have seen that a lot of teams either err on the side of updating a lot, and I like that, rather than updating never. And finding a good middle ground is quite hard, as you probably have experienced yourself. And what we saw is just having the information, hey, there is an update available, here is a pull request, you don't have to merge it, is already a lot of help to teams because they can easier guess how much effort an update would be if they go for it. If they now merge the pull request or not, isn't really the main thing, main improvement in my opinion. Yep.
Hi. How often does the Renovate job, or what would you recommend? How often should it run? Should it run on a daily basis, on a weekly basis, bi-weekly, hourly?
I mean, the answer is probably it depends. What we ended up doing is we have set at least daily is a good time frame to get updates in a regular interval. And when we have it set up in a way that, because Renovate allows, for example, interactive rebases. So if you say, hey, I want to retry this pull request, so we have set that up in a way that developers can say, I want now a run. So they can actively trigger that, or if we notice, for example, a Renovate pull request gets merged, this might mean that others need rebasing, so when we trigger a run, so we try to do it at least daily on a cron schedule, but then as well interactively if we kind of guess that a run might be helpful. We have seen from or heard from teams internally where some say, hey, I then just restrict Renovate to updating my dependencies on the weekend or once a month, maybe even because my CI system, I only want, on the weekend it can test all it wants. I don't care about the runtime there. Others have said, hey, I want it once a month. And we had even other teams asking us, hey, if I release an internal dependency, I want to get that propagated through my different repositories within like 2 hours. So these are the ones which might require a higher schedule, but that depends a bit on how you use it, how your teams. We found like on a daily basis is a good middle ground, and you can rather restrict it with configuration than to say, hey, I don't want that many updates, but yeah.
Presentation. Just following up on Thomas Graf's question. So we are from healthcare, and that becomes even big of a problem when you want to get all your, open source software license cleared, it becomes heavily scrutinized. So one of the approaches we were thinking of doing is for minor version updates. Let's say if you're doing minor version updates, and typically what's happening for us is with the FTA's scrutiny being so high, towards the end of the project, we get hit with security vulnerabilities. And then we end up updating all the open source software and the dependencies. And this has happened more frequently now. So one thought we had was any minor version update should just be automatic. Like it goes on the automated pipeline. We're working on integrating with some automated license clearing also within Healthineers. So that whole pipeline, minor version updates can be pretty much automated fully. For any major version update where there are breaking changes, then we can put it through the pipeline. Either then we see that developer intervention might be more prudent, right? So what do you think of this sort of an approach?
Yeah. I would say it depends a bit on how confident are you in your tests and your test strategy. If you are really confident, I think that's a great approach. And I have seen that internally as well, that teams say, okay, I'm updating updates of patch versions, I'm automating minor releases even. Or some teams say, okay, we are consuming an SAP internal library. For this one, we want automated merges because that's pretty much our sister team who creates that, and we know that if they do a patch release, that really should be backwards compatible. But we have seen on the other hand side as well that teams who are maybe not so confident in their test strategy, that they rather want to manually approve them. So I would say that's as well a maturity thing of the teams and your test coverage and other factors. Do you need a manual license review of each version? Yes, no, maybe only for minor versions. And so things like that play a role there on how confident are you to say, okay, I want to update it. I do think it's better to have an update request flow via pull request, so you have a version pinned, rather than saying, I want to consume latest or I want to consume just a major.minor version without having a patch version specified, because then you lose the transparency in when the update happened. At least having it in code and documented when an update happened allows you to trace back, hey, this was now what went wrong and I'm not doing okay. My install process now installed 3.2.1 instead .0, and I lose the transparency there, which I'm exactly consuming.
Okay, so thanks a lot for the talk. I'm not a fan though of these spam bots, but in general, I understand the use case. I was wondering, I mean, if you're just updating it like once a day and you're using maybe some JavaScript stuff, then probably the web frameworks have already updated 10 times during that time. So did you actually already run into issues that you need to force the Renovate bot to specifically update just to the next minor version instead of skipping one?
Not really. So most projects are able to perform like multiple jumps. You can configure Renovate in a way that it should create a pull request to update to each available next major or minor version. So you not get one pull request, but rather 1 to 1.22, 1.23, 1.24. And you then have to select the one which you pretty much want to update, because you maybe see that 23, 24 are red in your CI pipeline and 22 is working. Yeah.
So that means that if the Renovate bot actually holds back the next update until you merge actually the first one.
I mean, it's depending on your configuration, and I would recommend, if that's a concern, to not enable auto-merging, but rather it will just propose 3 updates at the same time, and your CI system can validate them, and then a developer can decide which one of these 3 updates do I want to do the minor version jump now, or do I want to stay safe and do a version by version. We actually had one case where we had to update to just the next minor version, Kubernetes updates, because there you need to cycle through the versions, at least with our automation. And you can make it work. It's a bit of dirty configuration with Renovate to say, I only want to get the next minor version instead of the highest available version. But I would recommend, if it's possible, to just create all the pull requests and then see if I can do the direct version jump. That's great, do it. if I need to go through it, that's maybe something a developer needs to take a look at.
Yeah, comment to these version updates. We tried this. So we tried to, or we talked to the teams and said, look, if you do only a minor update, we don't need to do so much license compliance work. And so we set up a complete proposal how to handle these things, what can be out, what not. The outcome of this test run was that the teams were not happy with this because they said it's too much work to decide, well, do I only want to have a minor update, but in this case, I do not want to have it. Here, I need the new feature, therefore, I want to have a bigger update, and here, we really are looking for the major update. So at the end, they said, it's more work for them to configure their systems and track everything that it does, instead of just deciding manually, this is what we want for our system. It doesn't need to apply everywhere, for sure, but this is why we stopped this approach.
Just a small, is okay. Just as an extra comment, that what's really good in the Renovate documentation, they do have an article about, like, it's called, I think, noise reduction or something, and that's very helpful. So just a recommendation, because everybody runs into these issues, too many MRs, too little, and so that's just a recommendation. Just check out the docs, it's really good.
Two minutes, okay. One last one.
Yeah, so just like maybe follow up from the previous. So it's like a single instance for everyone. Do you like automatically onboard new projects, and do you use like company-wide presets when you're onboarding projects?
Yeah, great question. So technically, it's not a single instance, but rather free, because we have free GitHub Enterprise servers. But generally, it's a single instance, and we decided to not use centrally provided presets, but rather we have a couple of rules which we apply to each project centrally, which are so specific that we say the chance that they are not working are rather small. So, for example, we have a specific versioning SAP internally, which we apply to each project. So that should be applicable to everyone. But besides that, we saw that internally the development processes are so different that if we say, hey, this preset maybe might make sense for one specific line of business, the other 7 lines of businesses don't like it. So we try to stick as much as possible to the central Renovate configuration and to the official upstream one. Added benefit is that people can actually Google their problems and just rely on the public available documentation, which is super helpful as well, to not have to say, okay, at SAP, we are now doing things slightly different, and you need to be aware of that. So sticking to the standard is always good.
That's a great one.
Thank you.